Across history, kings and emperors have ruled with armies, blades, and gold, but above all, they have ruled with belief. Faith has been the most powerful weapon, stronger than any sword and more enduring than any fortress. A kingdom divided by politics can still be united by fear of a god. A peasant with nothing can still obey if told that disobedience will anger the heavens. That is why rulers have always tolerated priests, mystics, and prophets, for as long as they were useful. But history has a darker side, one that rarely appears in royal inscriptions or religious texts. There were times when certain beliefs spiraled out of control, when rituals became too wild, when gods demanded too much, when faith was no longer an instrument of order, but a threat to the throne itself. And in those moments, kings did something unthinkable. They banned religion. Imagine a moonlit night in an ancient city, torches flickering along sandstone walls, the royal guard marching through alleyways not to arrest thieves or rebels, but worshippers. In the marketplace, a wooden altar lies burning as soldiers scatter offerings into the fire. Women cry out as sacred statues are smashed under iron boots. A royal decree is nailed to a temple door, by order of the king. This faith is hereby declared treason. What kind of belief could be so terrifying that even a king would risk angering the gods to suppress it? The answer lies in forgotten stories buried beneath official history. Stories of cults that danced until their bones broke. Priests who convinced farmers to starve themselves for divine visions. Ritual healers who infected the sick in hopes of driving out demons. Prophets who promised paradise not in heaven, but through rebellion. These were not just eccentric practices. They were ticking bombs. They challenged the king's authority, disrupted society, or simply horrified the public to the point of panic. Contrary to what we imagine today, ancient people were not blindly devout. They questioned, they feared, they laughed, and they doubted. And their rulers, far from being pious guardians, were often deeply suspicious of uncontrolled spirituality. Some kings believed in the gods, but more importantly, they believed in stability. If a ritual made people weak, it was banned. If a cult refused taxes, it was banned. If priests claimed they could summon storms unless they were paid tribute, they were branded as extortionists. Faith was permitted only when it served the throne. This documentary will explore those forbidden faiths. Not the noble religions recorded in holy texts, but the strange, the unsettling, the dangerous. We will travel through Mesopotamian cities where rain priests threatened to drown the land if ignored. We will enter medieval courts where animals stood trial like human criminals. We will witness ghost weddings in China, self-mummifying monks in Japan, blood-drinking healers in Europe, and kings who outlawed laughter because they believed joy invited demons. Some of these beliefs seem absurd today. Others feel disturbingly familiar. Throughout history, people have always searched for meaning, protection, and miracles. Sometimes they found comfort. Sometimes they found madness. But here is the true twist. Many of the world's biggest religions today were once considered forbidden cults. Christianity was banned in Rome. Buddhism was outlawed in India at different times. Even Islam faced suppression from pagan rulers. So what separates a ridiculous superstition from a world-changing faith? Is it divine truth, or political convenience? Who decides which God is real and which belief is insanity? The answer is simple: power. Not spiritual power, but human power. As you listen to this journey through forgotten rituals and royal crackdowns, remember this: every faith, no matter how strange, was once someone's truth. Every ritual, no matter how shocking, was born from hope, fear, or desperation. And every ban was not just a political act, but a declaration of war between kings and gods. By the end of this documentary, you may find yourself asking an uncomfortable question: in today's world, where millions follow influencers, conspiracy theories, self-help gurus, and digital prophets, what beliefs do we hold that future rulers might one day ban? History does not move in straight lines. The past is not dead, it lives quietly beneath the surface, waiting to rise again. Long before organized religion carved its doctrines into stone, people worshipped in raw, primal ways. They didn't gather in temples, they gathered on mountaintops. They didn't kneel before polished idols, they stared directly into the burning sun, believing that its fire could enter their souls. Across vast regions, Africa, South America, Eastern Europe, and even parts of Asia, there existed secret sects known to outsiders as sun-eaters. These were not metaphorical titles. They genuinely believed that by starving themselves and staring into sunlight for hours, even days, their body would become filled with divine radiance. Some fasted until their ribs protruded like cracked bark, claiming that hunger hollowed them so the sun could live inside. Others pressed hot stones to their skin, branding themselves with solar marks. Children were sometimes encouraged to stare at the horizon until their vision went white, a ritual known as opening the third fire. At first, local rulers tolerated them. After all, what harm could a few sun-gazers do? Some even praised them as holy hermits, free from greed and corruption. But admiration quickly turned to alarm. Farmers began abandoning their crops during peak season to gather on hilltops for sun feasts, which involved nothing more than fasting in silence. Warriors returned from these rituals too weak to lift their weapons. Communities starved, not from famine, but from faith. And then, something even stranger happened. A rumor spread that true believers no longer needed food at all, that sunlight alone could sustain them. It began with wandering mystics boasting that they had not eaten for 40 days. Some said they could drink only dew. Others insisted that tasting mortal food polluted their purity. Families were divided. Parents accused children of betraying the sun. Children accused their parents of being shadow eaters. Entire villages fell into chaos, not because of violence, but because people simply stopped living. They sat motionless from dawn to dusk, waiting to ascend in brightness. And many did ascend, but only into death. Bodies were found half buried in sand, arms stretched toward the sky as if begging for one last beam of warmth. That was when kings could no longer remain silent. One of the first to act was an unnamed ruler from the Nile Valley. Ancient inscriptions describe his fury not toward unbelievers, but toward believers. He declared that the sun belonged to everyone, not a chosen few, and that anyone claiming exclusive communion with it was committing treason. His soldiers stormed sun worship gatherings, dragging away the motionless fasters. Those who refused to eat were force-fed like prisoners. Others were branded with marks, not of the sun, but of the king, reminding them who truly ruled their lives. Across the world, similar crackdowns unfolded. In ancient Peru, Incan officials arrested villagers who held sun vigils without state approval. They confiscated polished sun mirrors used to scorch offerings. In Eastern Europe, Slavic warlords banned hilltop fasts after entire militias grew too weak to defend their borders. One particularly brutal decree stated, "He who stares at the sky too long shall be made to stare at stone." Historians believe this referred to blinding punishments. The irony is chilling. These rulers claimed to be defending life, yet they fought pacifists with violence. But to them, spiritual weakness was treason. An army that refuses to eat cannot march. A farmer who worships light instead of planting seed cannot feed a nation. And so the sun, once seen as the purest symbol of life, was declared dangerous. If faith made people strong, kings embraced it. If faith made people useless, kings destroyed it. However, not all sun-eaters surrendered. Some adapted. They hid their beliefs behind ordinary routines. They farmed by day, but prayed in secret through reflective bowls filled with golden water. They pretended to eat while secretly spitting food into cloths. They invented chants that sounded like work songs but were actually solar hymns. Even today, faint remnants of these rituals survive in surprising places. Certain folk dances where performers raise their arms toward the sky for long periods are believed to be echoes of ancient sun feasts. Some monks in Asia still fast for weeks claiming to absorb cosmic energy, though they no longer use the forbidden title of Sun Eater. In modern times, a few fringe groups have revived the practice under names like breatharianism, insisting that humans can survive on air and light alone. Doctors and scientists warn that such beliefs are deadly. Governments in some countries have issued public advisories condemning it. And so, thousands of years later, the same debate remains: is it devotion, or delusion? Perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is how thin the line is between admiration and fear. When someone shows discipline, we call them enlightened. When someone goes too far, we call them insane. Kings did not ban sun eaters because they danced wildly or attacked others. They banned them because their devotion was too extreme for society to function around. Faith became rebellion, not by sword, but by withdrawal. Most rebellions seek to overthrow rulers. This one simply walked away from life itself. And that, in the eyes of ancient kings, was a threat far more terrifying than any army. For how do you rule people who no longer desire food, pleasure, or survival? How do you control those who seek nothing but light? The story of the Sun Eaters is not just a tale of forbidden ritual. It is a mirror held up to every belief that demands sacrifice. Whether fasting, isolation, or obedience, at what point does devotion stop being noble and start being dangerous? Kings drew the line when faith disrupted order. But who draws that line today? As we move forward in this journey, we will see stranger cults, darker rituals, and even bloodier decrees. Some banned beliefs involved wild frenzy. Others involved chilling silence. Some were outlawed to save lives. Others were outlawed simply to protect power. But in every case, one lesson remains: belief may begin in the heart, but when it grows beyond control, it is the king's sword that answers. Long before kings claimed divine power, ordinary villagers believed there were people among them who could command the sky itself. They were known by many names: rain callers, storm summoners, thunder walkers. Some wore cloaks of feathers, believing birds carried messages to the clouds. Others covered themselves in mud, pretending to be creatures of the earth begging heaven for mercy. In small farming communities, these figures were first treated as heroes. When crops failed or rivers dried, the people didn't turn to kings or priests. They turned to the weather workers. If rain came after their ritual, they were worshipped. If it didn't, they were feared. Either way, their power did not depend on armies or laws, it depended on belief. At first, rulers tolerated them. A king could not control the sky, but if someone else could, why not let them try? It was easier to let peasants pour wine on the ground or chant to the wind than to send soldiers to silence them. But as time passed, the role of weather workers changed. What began as humble prayer turned into negotiation. And negotiation turned into blackmail. Some rain callers began demanding payment, not just offerings, but tribute. If you do not give what the sky desires, they warned, the clouds will turn against you. Suddenly, kings were no longer protectors. They were just another bargaining chip in a cosmic ransom. One ancient tablet from Mesopotamia tells of a group known as the Breathers, who claimed they could summon storms by inhaling the wind of the western deserts. Villagers brought them livestock, grain, even jewelry to ensure rain. But one season, when the tribute was not enough, the Breathers declared that the sky was offended and refused to perform their ritual. The fields withered. Wells dried. People panicked, not at nature, but at the cult that held it hostage. When the king finally intervened, he did not plead for rain. He marched an army into the Breathers' camp, burned their wind horns, and declared that from that day on, only the gods, not mortals, may command the weather. The Breathers were scattered, their rituals outlawed, and any attempt to pray for rain outside the royal temple was declared blasphemy. Across the ocean in ancient Mesoamerica, the pattern repeated. Rain was life. Without it, civilization crumbled. The Maya and Aztecs believed in powerful gods like Chak and Tlaloc, but the rituals to summon them were often controlled by small priesthoods who wielded terrifying authority. In drought years, these priests demanded extreme sacrifices, sometimes animals, sometimes humans. Kings allowed it, because rain was worth any price. But historians tell of rulers who began to fear that the priests were deliberately delaying rain to increase their power. There are carvings showing kings breaking into sacred grottos where water rituals occurred, confiscating idols shaped like clouds, and banning private ceremonies. Rain could still be summoned, but only under royal supervision. Belief was not forbidden. Unauthorized belief was. In medieval Europe, Christianity tried to erase weather magic, but could not destroy it. Villagers still believed in rain witches and storm monks. Some men claimed to tie knots in ropes that held back storms. Sailors bought wind in small bags, blowing into sails when the sea went still. Church records from Scandinavia tell of farmers who poured milk onto stones to feed the clouds. At first, clergy ignored this behavior, calling it harmless superstition. But when priests noticed that people trusted weather workers more than the church, they took offense. Bishops declared such practices demonic. Some rainmakers were tried as witches. Others were forced to perform rituals only under church supervision. The sky could be begged for mercy, but only in Latin. Yet the most fascinating cases came from Africa, where rain kings existed alongside political kings. In regions like Zimbabwe and Uganda, there were individuals believed to be born with storm spirits inside their chests. When these rain kings clashed with actual rulers, chaos erupted. One legend tells of a chief who refused to pay tribute to a rain king. In response, the rain king climbed a hill, lifted his arms, and declared a curse. Whether by coincidence or climate, no rain fell for weeks. The people sided with the rain king and abandoned the chief. Desperate, the chief attacked the rain king's shrine, but his own warriors refused to strike him, fearing lightning would kill them. Ultimately, the chief surrendered and made peace. But other rulers were not so patient. Some executed rain kings and banned the rituals entirely, declaring that no mortal should ever hold the sky hostage again. The strangest part of all this is how fear and faith mixed into a kind of spiritual politics. Did these cults actually control the weather? Probably not. But belief made them powerful. And kings could not tolerate power they did not control. Some rulers tried to absorb weather rights into their own authority. They declared themselves sons of the storm or built palaces aligned with the rising sun. Others invented fake rituals just to compete with real mystics. There are even records of kings secretly hiring former rain workers as advisors while publicly condemning them as frauds. Eventually, across civilizations, a pattern emerged. Prayer was allowed. Hope was allowed. But claiming control over nature was not. Calling on heaven was humble. Commanding heaven was treason. And so, weather workers either became official priests, or they vanished into legend. But ask yourself, has anything really changed? Today, we trust meteorologists rather than mystics. Yet there are still people who claim disasters are punishments from higher powers. There are still leaders who blame storms on sinners. The sky remains mysterious, unpredictable, and terrifying. We no longer burn rain collars, but we still argue about who has the right to speak for nature. As we move forward, the beliefs will grow stranger. Some rituals will demand laughter. Others will demand blood. Some will try to save the world. Others will try to end it. But all were banned for the same reason, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. To modern minds, the idea of putting an animal on trial seems absurd, even comical. Yet for centuries, humans believed not only that animals could be sacred, but also that they could be criminals. In ancient times, animals were not simply beasts to be used. They were seen as spiritual agents, capable of both miracles and mischief. A cat could be a messenger of a god. A snake could be the soul of an ancestor. A crow could be a spy for demons. And if these creatures acted out of line, humans believed justice had to be served. In ancient Egypt, cats were considered divine. Not special, divine. To harm one was not merely cruelty, it was blasphemy. One Greek historian recorded an incident where a Roman soldier accidentally killed a cat in Alexandria. He didn't mock it, didn't torture it, he simply stepped on it. A crowd gathered around him, furious not with shouts, but with silence. They dragged him from the street and tore him apart before the authorities could intervene. Even Egyptian rulers, who commanded armies and laborers by the tens of thousands, did not dare interfere when a cat was involved. Cats were not just pets, they were citizens of the divine rank. Killing one was treason against the gods. But the reverence for animals in some cultures had a darker mirror in others. In medieval Europe, animals were not worshipped, they were prosecuted. Court records from France, Italy, and Switzerland show entire legal proceedings held against pigs, rats, goats, and even insects. A sow accused of killing a child would be arrested, dressed in human clothing, given a lawyer, and placed on trial. Witnesses would swear oaths, judges would deliberate, and verdicts were passed with solemnity. If found guilty, the pig would be hanged, or worse, burned. There are even illustrated manuscripts showing donkeys in chains, rats being summoned by town criers, and roosters sentenced for laying eggs unnaturally, which people thought must be the work of the devil. Why go through such absurd theatrics? Because people believed animals possessed souls, or worse, were possessed. If a pig murdered a child, it wasn't just an accident. It was believed Satan had taken hold of the beast. To let it go unpunished would be to admit that evil could act freely without consequence. Justice had to be seen, even if the defendant couldn't understand it. And sometimes, it wasn't just lone animals. Entire swarms were given legal warnings. In one strange case from 16th century France, a swarm of locusts was sent a formal letter demanding they leave the vineyards within 6 days, or face divine punishment. When they didn't, priests excommunicated them. Yes, bugs were declared cut off from salvation. Meanwhile, in India, monkeys were elevated almost to nobility. Followers of the god Hanuman believed monkeys were living embodiments of divine power. They were fed, protected, even allowed to steal from markets without consequence. Kings passed laws forbidding harm to them. Yet tolerance had limits. When monkey populations spiraled and began raiding food supplies or attacking children, rulers found themselves in a dilemma: how do you control a sacred nuisance? Some tried relocating them. Others hired priests to perform cooling rituals to calm the monkey spirits. But outright punishment was rare. Fear of divine retaliation kept kings cautious. In Japan, foxes were believed to be shapeshifters, sometimes benevolent, sometimes malicious. Villagers accused fox spirits of theft, arson, or even seducing humans in disguise. Unlike Europe, where animals were punished physically, Japan punished them spiritually. Shrines were built not just to worship fox spirits but to negotiate with them. Offerings were placed to appease angry foxes, and priests performed banishment rituals if an animal was blamed for misfortune. It wasn't about guilt, it was about containment. Animals weren't criminals. They were supernatural neighbors. And then there were the animal gods who ruled above even kings. In Africa, among the Dogon and Yoruba, certain snakes and crocodiles were believed to be reincarnated ancestors. Killing one, even accidentally, required expensive purification ceremonies. A ruler who ignored such customs risked rebellion. In some regions, sacred crocodiles were given pawns within palace grounds, fed daily by royal servants. Anyone who mocked them could be exiled. But what happened when a sacred animal killed a person? Punishing it was forbidden. Yet leaving it alive angered the victim's family. So kings invented compromises. One ruler in Mali ordered that a sacred crocodile who had killed a villager must be banished with honor. It was captured and escorted with drums to another river, like an exiled prince. Each of these cases reveals a strange but profound truth: humans were desperate to believe that justice extended beyond themselves. If a man stole, he faced punishment. If a wolf stole, why should it be different? If a king could rule men, surely he could rule beasts. And if beasts could be holy, perhaps man was not as superior as he believed. Eventually, most rulers grew tired of such beliefs. Trials of animals were mocked by scholars. Sacred protections were removed from troublesome creatures. Laws were rewritten to state plainly: animals are not moral beings. They cannot sin. They cannot be sanctified. They are property. That view shaped the modern world. But even today, fragments of the old thinking remain. We still hold animals to moral standards, calling dogs loyal, cats evil, crows thieves. We still prosecute animals in media when they attack. Headlines read, "Killer tiger captured" or "Murderous dog put down," as if intent were proven. And in some corners of the world, sacred animals still roam freely, protected by law not out of science, but out of fear, reverence, and uncertainty. Kings may have outlawed animal gods and furry criminals, but the instinct to see more than fur and feathers has never truly died. It lingers in every superstition, every bedtime story, every time we talk to an animal as if it understands. Perhaps the real question isn't whether animals deserve trials or worship. It's whether humans ever stopped believing they were more like us than we dared to admit. In every corner of the world, love has been celebrated, forbidden, and feared. But in some ancient cultures, love went far beyond the mortal realm, it crossed into the supernatural. Men married rivers. Women wed mountains. Entire families arranged unions with spirits, ghosts, and statues, believing that these unions brought protection, prosperity, or divine favor. To outsiders, these relationships may seem bizarre or even grotesque, but to the believers, they were as real and binding as any marriage certificate. The consequences, however, were anything but ordinary. In ancient China, ghost marriages were common in certain regions. Families believed that a deceased unmarried person could not find peace unless a spouse was provided, alive or dead. This practice could prevent hauntings or secure blessings for the living. Sometimes, living individuals were married to the dead, their ceremonies indistinguishable from conventional weddings. Elaborate banquets were held. Gifts were exchanged. The couple, or at least one half of it, lay in a coffin during the ritual. For centuries, these marriages were tolerated, even encouraged, by local authorities, as they reinforced social cohesion and honored ancestors. But eventually, imperial decrees began to forbid ghost marriages. The government feared that the living were being coerced into union with the dead and that estates were being unjustly transferred to satisfy rituals. People resisted. Laws were ignored. Families continued arranging ceremonies in secret. It became a battle between filial piety and the law, a quiet rebellion hidden behind curtains of silk. Meanwhile, across the mountains in India, devotion often took a more physical and sometimes dangerous form. Statues of deities were believed to be living, receptive partners. Certain sects believed that marrying a goddess's image could bring fertility or wealth. Priests performed ceremonies, reciting sacred mantras while the devotee clasped the statue in elaborate ritual embraces. Kings initially tolerated these practices, seeing them as harmless devotion. But as sects grew more secretive and powerful, the state began to worry. Wealthy devotees poured gold into temples, bypassing royal taxes, while some priests used these marriages to manipulate followers. Eventually, monarchs banned marriages to statues and punished the most influential priests. Yet the belief persisted, moving into hidden shrines, where devotion remained private but intense. Japan's folklore tells of mountain spirits known as yokai, many of which were considered seducers. Young men and women were believed to be lured into permanent unions with these spirits. Legends recount entire villages where certain families claimed descent from supernatural unions, giving them special powers, influence, or access to forbidden knowledge. Kings and shoguns saw such claims as threats to the order of succession and to social stability. If a spirit could confer extraordinary power on one family, it might destabilize alliances, inheritance, and even military loyalty. Edicts were issued to punish those claiming spiritual marriages, but enforcement was sporadic, and the most isolated villages continued the practice for generations. Europe, too, had its share of forbidden loves. In the medieval period, witches were often accused of forming intimate bonds with demons or incubi and succubi. These relationships were portrayed as morally and spiritually dangerous, a direct affront to both church and crown. Individuals accused of such unions were often tried and executed. Unlike the ghost or statue marriages, which focused on protection and devotion, these relationships were seen as seductive and subversive, a corruption of the natural order. Yet even here, elements of desire, devotion, and fear intertwined. The accused often swore that their unions were consensual or spiritually guided, raising uncomfortable questions about free will, obedience, and the limits of belief. In all these cases, rulers were confronted with the same dilemma: personal belief versus public order. While unions with spirits or statues may seem private, they often carried broader implications. Land transfers, wealth distribution, social hierarchies, and religious authority could all be influenced by these marriages. A king or emperor could not allow unchecked supernatural unions to undermine the legal or political structure. Consequently, many of these marriages were banned not simply because they were strange, but because they threatened human authority over property, succession, and societal norms. Yet, even as kings tried to legislate the boundaries of love, believers found ways to continue their devotion. Ceremonies moved underground. Gifts were exchanged in secret. Shrines were hidden in forests, on mountaintops, or behind false walls. The laws may have forbidden the marriages, but they could not extinguish the desire to connect with the unseen, the spiritual, or the divine. In some areas, these practices persisted into the modern era, hidden from official eyes but alive in folk traditions, superstitions, and family rituals. The fascination with unions beyond the human world speaks to a deeper truth: humans have always yearned to reach beyond themselves, to connect with forces they cannot control, and to find love in forms that defy reality. Kings banned these unions because they were inconvenient, dangerous, or threatening, but believers persisted, driven by hope, fear, and devotion. The line between devotion and defiance blurred. Laws forbidding marriages to ghosts or spirits were not only acts of governance but acts of control over imagination, desire, and destiny itself. As we continue this journey through ancient beliefs that rulers feared, it becomes clear that the strangest ideas are often the most powerful. Love that transcends life and death, that bends the natural order, or that challenges the authority of kings, is the very thing rulers cannot tolerate. It disrupts law, hierarchy, and inheritance, and it challenges the notion of who controls reality itself. In the stories of ghost weddings, spirit brides, and sacred unions, we find a haunting reminder: devotion has always been a double-edged sword, capable of inspiring wonder and invoking fear in equal measure. In the ancient world, the boundary between healing and harm was often razor-thin. Medicine was not a science but a mixture of observation, superstition, and ritual. A healer who claimed the power to cure the sick could become a community hero, or a mortal threat. Some of the strangest practices arose from a single belief, that death and disease were not accidents but messages from gods, demons, or ancestors. To cure illness, one had to appease these forces, or manipulate them, sometimes at terrifying cost. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, there existed healers who turned to substances and rituals modern medicine would classify as deadly. In medieval Europe, powdered mummy, literally ground human remains, was sold as a cure for everything from headaches to epilepsy. People paid fortunes for it, believing that the essence of the dead could heal the living. Priests and kings tolerated it at first, seeing it as a harmless superstition. But as trade networks expanded, the practice became scandalous. Corpses were dug up from royal tombs and churchyards, desecrated in ways that shocked society. Eventually, monarchs and church authorities stepped in, outlawing the trade. But enforcement was difficult. Merchants hid the practice behind exotic names and distant origins, and people continued consuming powdered mummies in secret. Other deadly cures were less macabre but equally dangerous. Trepanation, drilling holes into the skull, was practiced in Europe, Africa, and South America to release evil spirits or cure mental illness. Some patients survived, and these successes created legends that reinforced the practice. But countless others died from infection or blood loss. In some cultures, trepanation was legal and even state-sanctioned, but when deaths began to spike in populous areas, kings issued edicts banning unauthorized trepanation. Doctors who continued the procedure were punished, though underground healers persisted. Blood consumption was another common, and deadly, practice. In parts of the Middle East and Europe, patients were encouraged to drink animal blood, believing it contained life force that could cure weakness, plague, or infertility. In certain rituals, small amounts of human blood were administered to the ill. Kings and local rulers grew concerned when outbreaks of disease spread through these healing ceremonies. Edicts forbade blood drinking, labeling it both a health hazard and a threat to public order. Yet in rural areas, where superstition ran deep, healers adapted, switching to symbolic substitutes like red wine or pig's blood, claiming the effect was identical. Plague-era Europe revealed another deadly dimension of ritual healing. Some healers believed that the Black Death was caused by angry spirits or poisonous winds. Their remedies included fumigation with toxic herbs, burning sulfur, or administering mercury-based potions. While occasionally effective, these treatments often killed patients outright. Kings and city councils could not ignore these deaths. In Florence, Venice, and Paris, authorities passed laws forbidding unlicensed healers from administering any remedy without supervision. Those who ignored the law faced public execution, not for murder, but for interfering with the divine order of life and health. Ancient China and Japan had their own lethal practices. Taoist and Shinto healers often used rare minerals or animal parts in concoctions believed to strengthen the body or prolong life. Some included mercury, arsenic, or even powdered tiger bones. These substances were potent and sometimes fatal. While emperors occasionally sought such remedies for themselves, they forbade the general population from using them without state approval. One imperial edict from the Tang dynasty reads, "Whoever sells elixirs claiming immortality shall be executed, and their household shall be destroyed." The paranoia was not merely about death, it was about control. Kings and emperors could tolerate risk for themselves, but they could not allow dangerous healers to undermine the health and productivity of their citizens. In Africa, the line between medicine and magic was equally fraught. Traditional healers mixed herbal cures with animal parts, blood rituals, and incantations. Some were believed to channel ancestral spirits, offering protection or curing illness. But a healer who miscalculated, or deliberately harmed a patient, could spark rebellion. Kings intervened, banning certain deadly treatments while simultaneously endorsing safe rituals. Healing became political as much as medical, because disease could destabilize villages, armies, and trade. One misstep in curing a nobleman could lead to execution, exile, or confiscation of property. Even when a practice did not kill directly, it could still disrupt society. Some rituals required fasting or isolation for days, leaving entire communities vulnerable during critical agricultural or military seasons. Soldiers who abstained from food under the guidance of mystical healers could weaken an army in the middle of a campaign. Farmers who refused to plant crops because of prophetic instructions risked famine. In these cases, kings and rulers saw the healer not as a savior, but as a saboteur. Laws were passed banning dangerous medicine, and compliance became a measure of loyalty. The paradox of ancient medicine is striking: those who sought to save lives often caused death, while those who issued bans sought to preserve life, order, and authority. Healing was never just about curing the body, it was a negotiation between power, superstition, and survival. Kings banned practices not because they failed to inspire faith, but because they failed to preserve life in the way rulers deemed necessary. In a world without hospitals or scientific knowledge, the stakes were existential. One mistake could mean famine, disease, or civil unrest. And yet, despite royal prohibitions, human curiosity and desperation ensured that deadly medicine persisted. People hid rituals, disguised substances, and whispered secrets across generations. Some traditions survived into the modern era, influencing alternative medicine, folk remedies, and even early pharmacology. The tension between belief and control, between cure and catastrophe, remains a lesson in the dangers of unchecked faith, the limits of authority, and the enduring human desire to grasp life itself, even at its most perilous edges. In a quiet village square, the air heavy with heat and dust, people begin to move. At first, it is subtle, a foot tapping, a hand clapping. Then the rhythm grows, contagious. Arms rise and fall, heads roll, bodies twist unnaturally. Before long, hundreds are dancing in fevered frenzy, ignoring food, ignoring sleep, ignoring even their own safety. They do not dance for joy, nor for entertainment. They dance because the gods, or spirits, or some invisible force, demand it. For centuries, this was not uncommon. What we now call mass hysteria, medieval observers called divine madness. One of the earliest recorded cases occurred in the Rhineland during the Middle Ages. Entire communities began dancing in the streets for days, some for weeks. Their movements were erratic and violent. People collapsed from exhaustion, and yet, they continued, almost as if driven by an external will. Some witnesses claimed to see visions, bright lights, phantom animals, or angels moving among the dancers. Town leaders initially thought it was a religious celebration. Priests preached, musicians played, and villagers joined in. But soon the dancing claimed its first victims. Old and young alike collapsed in exhaustion, some dying mid-step. Panic spread faster than the music. Authorities, unprepared for such phenomena, had to intervene. Kings and city councils issued orders forbidding public gatherings without permission, citing divine possession and public safety. Yet, despite threats of imprisonment or corporal punishment, outbreaks continued sporadically for decades, each leaving its mark on the collective memory of the region. Farther east, in the lands of ancient Greece, followers of Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos, engaged in what historians call Bacchic rituals. These were not casual festivals. The participants entered a state of frenzy, often stripping off clothing, screaming, and sometimes attacking each other in a mix of ecstasy and ritual combat. Ordinary citizens were warned to stay clear, for the Bacchic rites could turn deadly. Kings tolerated these rituals only when they occurred outside urban centers. When such rites spilled into city streets, monarchs intervened with brutal force, banning the worship or restricting it to secretive cults. The ruler's fear was not only for physical harm but also for the psychological power these rituals granted to the participants. Those who surrendered to the frenzy could no longer be controlled, they became instruments of chaos. Medieval Tarantism in Italy presents a curious variation of the same phenomenon. People bitten by a supposedly venomous spider were said to enter an uncontrollable dance until their bodies expelled the poison. Local music and communal dancing were essential for this healing process. Entire villages became engulfed in rhythmic mania. Kings and church officials eventually stepped in, forbidding public dancing and compelling victims to remain indoors or in private chapels. Yet Tarantism adapted. Musicians learned to play hidden tunes for the afflicted, and dances continued in secret, preserving the ancient belief in the curative power of movement. Here, the boundary between health, superstition, and law blurred dangerously. In Africa, ritual dances could also sweep communities into temporary madness. Certain tribes believed that spirits of ancestors would possess dancers during festivals. These performances were elaborate, requiring stamina and endurance. Participants often fasted beforehand and entered trance-like states. Kings permitted these ceremonies because they reinforced social cohesion and respect for lineage. However, when the rituals were abused, when trances turned violent, when sacrifices escalated beyond custom, the rulers imposed bans. Dancing became tightly regulated, with only authorized dancers permitted to perform, and public gatherings were strictly supervised to prevent panic or accidental deaths. Even in the New World, before European colonization, Aztec and Mayan civilizations had ceremonial dances that demanded complete surrender to divine forces. Dancers wore heavy headdresses, chanted ancient hymns, and sometimes pierced their bodies as offerings. These ceremonies were dangerous, but they were also seen as necessary to ensure the favor of the gods. Kings tolerated these rituals because they were deeply embedded in political and religious life. Yet if a festival spiraled into chaos, the ruling class would intervene. The king's approval was essential, and any unsanctioned frenzy could be punished with exile or death. What links all these examples is a simple yet profound fear: humans who surrender completely to ritual can become ungovernable. Kings understood this. Mass hysteria was not only a health threat, it was a political threat. When people danced to invisible rhythms, when their bodies refused to obey, they challenged authority itself. A king who could not stop a communal frenzy was a king whose power was questioned. Edicts banning public dances, punishing frenzied participants, or restricting musical instruments were attempts to reassert control, to draw lines between devotion and rebellion. The paradox is haunting. Dancing, something we now associate with joy, freedom, and entertainment, was once a weapon of the gods, or a weapon against human rulers. Those who surrendered to the divine rhythm often did so out of genuine belief. Yet the consequences were deadly. Communities were torn, armies weakened, and rulers forced to intervene. The dance could save the soul, but it could destroy the body. It could bring favor, but it could also bring punishment. Even today, echoes of these ancient frenzies survive in folk traditions, festivals, and cultural rituals. Carnival celebrations, trance ceremonies, and ecstatic dance movements all hint at humanity's enduring fascination with surrendering control. What has changed is the context. The king no longer wields a sword over the rhythm. But the thrill, and the danger, remains. The dance of madness is a reminder that belief, devotion, and ecstasy have always carried power that can terrify and destabilize, whether sanctioned or forbidden. In the end, kings banned not the dance itself, but the uncontrollable surrender it inspired. That surrender, they knew, was stronger than armies, mightier than law, and capable of shaking the foundations of society itself. In the eyes of ancient kings, taxes were more than a financial obligation, they were proof of loyalty, a sign that a subject recognized the ruler's authority. But across civilizations, some beliefs threatened to disrupt this system in ways that rulers could not tolerate. People began to worship gods who promised relief from tribute, deities who demanded nothing from their followers but obedience to invisible laws. These were the tax rebellion gods, divine figures who, whether real or imagined, encouraged defiance against earthly authorities. And when devotion to such gods spread, kings acted quickly, often violently, to suppress them. One of the earliest recorded examples comes from Mesopotamia. Certain small communities worshipped a deity known only in fragments of clay tablets. This god promised protection for farmers who refused to pay tribute to the city-state. His name, now lost, inspired fear among the rulers because his followers literally abandoned the tax rolls. When collectors arrived, they found empty fields and abandoned homes. Families claimed that their god had cursed the land if they obeyed the king's demands. The ruler responded with force. Temples were burned, tablets destroyed, and priests were executed. Yet fragments of the gods' worship persisted underground, carried on by whispers, secret offerings, and hidden shrines. Ancient Egypt also provides a striking example. Certain local cults were devoted to gods who promised fertility and protection in exchange for moral purity rather than tribute. Farmers and artisans found this appealing, particularly during famine years, when the state demanded taxes in grain. These cults quickly gained followers. Kings tolerated them at first, recognizing their role in maintaining social cohesion. But as their popularity grew, rulers realized that obedience to divine law threatened obedience to royal law. Edicts were issued banning worship that refused royal taxes. Temples that promoted alternative loyalties were dismantled, and statues of rebellious gods were smashed. The people were forced to choose between survival under the king and devotion to a god who promised abundance for the obedient but punished the tax-compliant. In pre-Columbian America, the Aztecs faced similar challenges. Certain communities venerated gods who demanded offerings only from the poor, claiming that tribute to the emperor's treasury was cursed or unlucky. Local rulers attempted to enforce Aztec tax law, but the promises of divine favor encouraged evasion. Some priests instructed villagers to hide harvests or to perform rituals in secret, claiming that the emperor would be punished by the gods if they complied with his demands. The emperor's solution was brutal: temples of dissenting gods were razed, rebellious priests were executed, and surviving communities were forcibly reintegrated into the tribute system. These interventions were not motivated purely by wealth, they were about control. A god who undermined taxation undermined authority itself. Even in medieval Europe, tax rebellion gods took subtler forms. Saints and local spirits were sometimes invoked to protect peasants from harsh levies imposed by kings or feudal lords. Tales circulated of saints punishing tax collectors or cursing towns that overcollected. These beliefs were tolerated to a degree, but when stories of miraculous resistance inspired actual evasion, rulers acted decisively. In some French and German villages, priests accused of encouraging tax resistance were excommunicated or executed. In England, folk rituals promising divine protection from royal levies were outlawed. Kings feared that if belief in protective spirits spread, the very foundation of governance, compliance, would crumble. Asia, too, witnessed such conflicts. In China, Taoist sects occasionally encouraged followers to donate only to the temple or to gods, rather than paying state taxes. During periods of weak imperial control, entire counties would redirect their wealth, leaving officials frustrated and desperate. The emperor responded with sweeping bans, arresting leaders, destroying shrines, and issuing decrees that only state-approved gods could receive offerings. Yet the beliefs persisted in secret, passed from one generation to the next, hidden in poetry, folk songs, and clandestine ceremonies. What is striking about these cases is the intersection of devotion and politics. The gods themselves were often imagined, their rituals symbolic. But to kings, belief was reality. A population devoted to a god who defied taxation was, in effect, a rebellious population. The line between spiritual and civil disobedience was blurred, and rulers treated both with the same severity. Punishments were harsh not merely to enforce obedience, they were warnings. Kings wanted the message clear: divine protection does not excuse defiance of earthly authority. The gods may watch over the faithful, but the king's law must prevail. And yet, despite bans, resistance persisted. Some peasants secretly continued worship, diverting a portion of tribute to hidden shrines. Stories of miraculous protection from tax collectors circulated widely, inspiring hope and defiance. Even today, historians find evidence of clandestine religious practices designed to protect communities from exploitation, showing that belief in alternative authority, divine rather than royal, has always been a powerful form of rebellion. The lesson of the tax rebellion gods is timeless. Belief can empower the powerless, offering protection, justice, or hope where earthly rulers fail. But it can also destabilize kingdoms, prompting violent suppression. Kings banned these gods not because they lacked followers or miracles, but because the devotion of ordinary people threatened the very foundation of control. Across centuries and continents, the same pattern repeated: faith versus authority, devotion versus obedience, hope versus law. The gods themselves may have vanished, but the struggle they represented, between belief and power, remains etched into history. We often think of laughter as harmless, even joyful, a natural human expression that unites communities. But in certain times and places, laughter was feared, forbidden, and even punished. It was not the simple pleasure of a joke that threatened rulers, it was the unpredictable power of laughter to disrupt hierarchy, subvert authority, and awaken uncomfortable truths. Across centuries, kings and religious leaders understood that when people laughed at the wrong time, or in the wrong way, they could become dangerous, uncontrollable, or subversive. And so, in some societies, laughter itself became a crime. In medieval France, records tell of jesters who were hired by kings not merely to entertain, but to test boundaries. Their jokes sometimes revealed uncomfortable truths about the ruling class. Nobles who laughed at the king's folly might be tolerated, but commoners who laughed in public could face arrest, fines, or exile. Laughter was dangerous because it leveled social hierarchies, if only for a moment. A single uproarious jest could undermine authority, spread dissent, or encourage ridicule of the powerful. Some kings, unable to eliminate humor entirely, regulated it. Court jesters were licensed, and their performances monitored. Unlicensed jesters, wandering from village to village, were sometimes executed or imprisoned for causing civil disorder through laughter. In other regions, laughter was believed to be literally contagious, and therefore threatening. In Renaissance Italy, towns experienced outbreaks of mass laughter that historians now call laughing epidemics. Entire communities would collapse into fitful, unstoppable laughter for days, sometimes weeks. People could not eat, sleep, or perform daily tasks. The elders interpreted this as divine punishment or demonic possession. Kings and city councils responded with a mix of fear and authoritarian control. Public gatherings were banned, clergy performed exorcisms, and anyone spreading the laughter was accused of witchcraft or sedition. The paradox was cruel: laughter, the outward expression of joy, was treated as a disease that threatened survival. In Japan, during the Edo period, laughter could be regulated because it carried social and moral implications. Certain Buddhist sects preached that excessive or inappropriate laughter could disturb spiritual balance, anger ancestors, and invite misfortune. The shogunate often endorsed these views as a way to maintain order. Public merriment outside sanctioned festivals could result in fines, corporal punishment, or exile. Merchants, craftsmen, and villagers were warned to maintain decorum, and laughter at sacred occasions was considered blasphemy. To modern eyes, this seems extreme. But in societies where hierarchy, ritual, and obedience governed daily life, laughter was not merely trivial, it was a disruption that could ripple across the social fabric. Even in Africa, laughter could be dangerous. Certain tribes believed that excessive laughter invited spiritual attacks. Shamans warned that uncontrolled mirth could open a person to possession, illness, or misfortune. Kings sometimes codified these beliefs into law, punishing individuals who laughed at inappropriate times, especially during sacred ceremonies or before judgment councils. Laughter was not eliminated entirely, it was channeled, timed, and ritualized. The social lesson was clear: joy without discipline was threatening, both spiritually and politically. Europe's witch trials often reveal another dimension of laughter. Women accused of witchcraft were sometimes condemned not for spells or potions, but for their laughter. It was believed that mocking the clergy, laughing at sermons, or giggling during prayer were signs of allegiance to the devil. Records from France, Germany, and Scotland describe women interrogated about their laughter, pressed to reveal whether it was innocent or malicious. Those who could not convince the authorities of its purity were punished, often with death. Laughter was framed as rebellion, a deliberate act of defiance against both earthly and divine authority. In this sense, it was a crime of intention as much as expression. The irony is profound. Kings sought to ban laughter not because it harmed anyone physically, but because it threatened control. When a population laughs together, boundaries blur. A servant may mock a lord. A peasant may ridicule injustice. A community may momentarily reject hierarchy. For rulers, such moments were dangerous, unpredictable, and subversive. Laws against laughter were attempts to enforce order, but they also reveal the vulnerability of power in the face of human spontaneity. Yet humans are remarkably resilient. Even when punished, people found ways to laugh in secret. Folk tales, whispered jokes, and hidden performances became ways to circumvent royal authority. Festivals, carnivals, and masquerades provided sanctioned outlets for controlled chaos, where laughter could erupt without directly challenging kings or priests. These events remind us that humor cannot be entirely legislated away. It can be suppressed temporarily, monitored, or channeled, but never truly eliminated. The history of criminalized laughter leaves a haunting message: what seems harmless may be threatening in a society built on rigid hierarchy. Kings banned laughter not out of moral principle, but out of fear. They feared its ability to unite, disrupt, and empower. They feared its unpredictability. And they feared that a simple expression of joy could awaken rebellion. In every documented case, from French jesters to Japanese rituals, from African shamans to European witch trials, laughter was far more than amusement. It was a force, invisible yet potent, capable of undermining authority and revealing truths that rulers would rather suppress. In this sense, laughter as a crime stands alongside other forbidden beliefs we have explored. It is a reminder that human expression, in all its forms, dance, devotion, ritual, or mirth, has always carried power. And when that power challenges kings, laws, or social order, it is no longer seen as innocent. It becomes dangerous. It becomes forbidden. And it becomes history. Throughout history, knowledge has always been power, and with power comes fear. Kings, emperors, and rulers understood this intuitively. A peasant with forbidden wisdom, a scholar with radical ideas, or a healer with secret knowledge could destabilize kingdoms and challenge authority. In many cases, it was not rebellion or weapons that kings feared most, but information itself. Certain beliefs, texts, and practices were so potent, so threatening to control, that they were banned, burned, or hidden, often under penalty of death. The story of rulers who feared knowledge is as old as civilization itself. In ancient Egypt, priests were the custodians of immense wisdom. They controlled knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and the afterlife, carefully rationing it to maintain social hierarchy. Pharaohs understood that knowledge could inspire awe, but also fear. A commoner who learned sacred geometry, or the secrets of the Nile's flooding cycles, could manipulate resources, challenge temple authority, or even predict the king's failures. To prevent this, laws forbade the dissemination of certain texts, while scribes and teachers were carefully monitored. Knowledge was both a tool and a weapon, and the punishment for unauthorized learning could be exile, forced labor, or execution. The tension between enlightenment and suppression shaped Egyptian society for centuries, ensuring that the masses remained dependent, obedient, and awed. Ancient China offers another chilling example. The emperors of the Qin and Han dynasties burned books, executed scholars, and banned intellectual discourse that might challenge the state. History, philosophy, and even poetry were censored if they contained critiques of the emperor or suggestions that undermined the rigid hierarchy. The famous burning of Confucian texts under Qin Shi Huang was not merely an attack on ideas, it was an attack on the capacity of knowledge to create independent thought. Knowledge that empowered the individual was seen as dangerous, potentially more threatening than armies or fortresses. Scholars went into hiding, passed knowledge orally, and created secret schools to preserve ideas that kings feared. In medieval Europe, the fear of knowledge often intertwined with religion. The church and monarchs both feared that literacy, study of forbidden texts, or philosophical inquiry could destabilize belief systems and weaken their authority. Certain books were banned, libraries censored, and scholars persecuted for promoting ideas considered heretical. The Inquisition exemplifies the deadly intersection of fear and knowledge. Those who questioned dogma or revealed truths about the natural world could be tortured or burned. Even scientific observation was fraught with danger. Galileo's trial for advocating heliocentrism was not merely a conflict of ideas, it was a warning to the public: knowledge that undermines authority is punishable, and intellectual curiosity must submit to power. In the Islamic Golden Age, rulers sometimes protected knowledge, but tension persisted. Scholars who revealed truths about mathematics, astronomy, or medicine could be revered or reviled. Certain texts were restricted to court scholars, while public dissemination was controlled. Knowledge was carefully graded. Too much understanding among ordinary people threatened taxation, military control, and religious authority. Rulers feared that an informed populace could challenge social hierarchies, resist corvée labor, or ignore laws that relied on ignorance. In response, they institutionalized education while simultaneously banning subversive works, blending encouragement with control. Africa and the Americas also offer vivid examples of kings who feared knowledge. In the Mali Empire, griots, keepers of oral history, held immense power, able to influence perception of kings and policy through storytelling. A griot who revealed certain truths could destabilize the court or undermine the ruler's legitimacy. To prevent this, kings controlled the narrative, punishing those who disseminated dangerous stories and rewarding loyalty among the griots. In Mesoamerica, priests monitored astronomical knowledge and agricultural secrets, understanding that mastery over the seasons gave one indirect power over the populace. Certain rituals were restricted to elites, and knowledge was rarely shared with commoners. Kings feared that revealing secrets could embolden subjects, weaken tribute, or threaten dynastic stability. The pattern is universal: knowledge is never neutral. Whether in the hands of priests, scholars, or commoners, it carries potential for empowerment and danger. Kings feared it because it challenges hierarchy, destabilizes obedience, and opens minds to ideas they cannot control. In every case, suppression followed a similar pattern: banning texts, restricting access, executing dissenters, and creating fear around forbidden knowledge. These measures reveal a paradox: rulers wanted progress, innovation, and wisdom, but only within boundaries they could dictate. Anything outside those limits was dangerous, even deadly. Yet, as history shows, knowledge cannot be completely suppressed. Ideas survived in secret texts, oral traditions, underground schools, and whispered conversations. Forbidden knowledge inspired revolutions, scientific breakthroughs, and social transformation. Kings who feared knowledge may have controlled their subjects for a time, but ultimately, human curiosity proved more resilient than tyranny. The stories of these rulers remind us that fear of the mind is as ancient as fear of armies, that ideas can terrify, destabilize, and inspire simultaneously. Knowledge, once banned, often becomes the seed of the next era, a reminder that even kings cannot fully control thought, imagination, or truth. In the end, the kings who feared knowledge teach a lesson still relevant today: controlling information is never neutral, and suppressing thought is an admission of vulnerability. Across cultures and centuries, rulers sought to guard their authority by limiting what people could know, but they could not erase curiosity. Knowledge is a living, breathing force, capable of shaping societies, toppling empires, and illuminating truths that kings would rather hide. And this tension, between the ruler who fears, and the mind that seeks, remains at the heart of human history. Objects are more than mere tools or decorations. In the eyes of ancient peoples, they can embody power, danger, and even the supernatural. A single artifact, a statue, a book, a weapon, or a jewel, could inspire fear, reverence, or obsession. In many societies, kings feared certain objects because they carried the potential to destabilize authority, spread disease, or invoke curses. These forbidden objects were often hidden, destroyed, or outlawed. To touch them, or even possess them, was to risk divine wrath, social punishment, or political retribution. In ancient Egypt, amulets and relics were not merely protective charms, they were believed to house spirits. Some amulets contained the essence of deceased pharaohs, while others were said to carry the blessing, or curse, of gods. Priests guarded these objects carefully. A commoner found wearing an amulet meant only for royalty could face imprisonment or death. Kings feared the misuse of such objects because they were more than symbolic. They could confer legitimacy, influence the supernatural, or provoke envy and rebellion. Certain tomb artifacts were considered so potent that tomb robbers were executed not merely for theft, but for violating sacred law and risking divine vengeance. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets and cylinder seals could contain knowledge of spells, incantations, and ritual formulas. Some of these were restricted to temple elites, because the untrained could unleash curses or summon spirits beyond human control. One tablet, recorded in cuneiform, describes a ritual to bring misfortune to an enemy city. The text itself was considered dangerous. Kings ordered that it be locked away, warning that even reading it without guidance could bring illness, insanity, or death. Forbidden objects in this context were not merely possessions, they were conduits for supernatural power, capable of shifting political balance if misused. Ancient China had its own version of dangerous artifacts. Jade, bronze, and rare minerals were imbued with spiritual significance. Certain imperial seals, used to legitimize decrees, were considered so powerful that losing them could destabilize the realm. Objects associated with immortality, such as elixirs or talismans, were restricted to the emperor and his court. Anyone else caught possessing these items could be executed. Beyond political concerns, these forbidden objects were thought to bring curses if handled improperly. Kings feared the consequences of misuse. Plagues, natural disasters, or rebellion could all follow from the unapproved circulation of powerful items. In Europe, relics of saints and martyrs were highly prized but also dangerous. Possessing a relic without permission, or attempting to trade it, could provoke curses or incite political tension. Certain holy objects were believed to confer authority, the right to rule, to speak, or to lead an army. Kings and bishops often banned the possession of relics outside sanctioned churches. Stories of cursed relics abound: crucifixes that allegedly brought death to thieves, chalices that struck down those who stole from the altar, and rings that doomed entire families. The belief in these curses was so strong that even suspicion of unauthorized possession could be punishable by execution. In Africa, sacred objects, masks, statues, or ritual instruments, were protected by elaborate taboos. Villagers feared that violating these taboos could bring misfortune not only upon the individual but upon entire communities. Kings enforced these prohibitions strictly, recognizing that power often resided in the symbolic authority of objects. Breaking the rules could invite social chaos or spiritual disaster. Even minor infractions, such as touching a ceremonial staff without permission, could lead to exile, imprisonment, or ritual cleansing. Forbidden objects were thus not only culturally significant, they were instruments of social control. The Americas had similar traditions. In Mesoamerican civilizations, certain jade figurines, ceremonial knives, and obsidian mirrors were restricted to the priesthood. Their misuse was thought to provoke the gods, leading to famine, disease, or war. Kings and priests maintained strict oversight, punishing anyone who dared interfere. These objects were more than religious artifacts, they were symbols of divine and political authority, and their misuse could disrupt social harmony or challenge the legitimacy of rulers. Even today, archaeological finds reveal caches of deliberately hidden artifacts, suggesting that ancient societies understood the risks of unchecked access. What unites these examples is the same core principle: forbidden objects were feared not only for their supernatural potential but for their ability to challenge authority. A king could tolerate devotion, ritual, or even rebellion, but if an object could grant tangible power, inspire fear, or provoke misfortune, it became a threat that required suppression. Kings banned, destroyed, or hid such objects to maintain control, often invoking fear of divine retribution to enforce compliance. Yet the allure of forbidden objects was irresistible. Across cultures, legends abound of explorers, thieves, and commoners who risked life and limb to acquire them. Many believe that touching, stealing, or even glimpsing these items could confer wisdom, wealth, or magical protection. The tension between danger and desire, fear and fascination, kept these objects at the center of mythology, folklore, and historical record. Kings may have feared them, but humans were compelled to seek them. Power, mystery, and curiosity ensured that forbidden objects would always occupy a space between reverence and rebellion, law and legend. In the end, the curse of forbidden objects illustrates a timeless truth: objects are never neutral. They carry the weight of belief, the risk of misfortune, and the potential to disrupt authority. Kings banned them not because they were inherently evil, but because their existence challenged the carefully constructed order of society. And while many objects were destroyed or hidden, the legend survived, whispered in secret, preserved in text, or revealed in archaeological finds, reminding us that fascination with the forbidden has always been a dangerous and irresistible human trait.